I'm Rob Neyer. Welcome to your Break It Down show. This is a special occasion. I am so happy to congratulate the Break It Down show and my friend Pete Turner on episode number 1000. Pretty exciting stuff. I have known Pete for a few years. He has always been incredibly gracious with his time and with his talent and his spirit. I have joined Pete a few times on the show. Most memorably, Pete was in Portland once, where I live, and we actually sat across from each other at a coffee shop and had a great conversation. And I've always been impressed by his knowledge and, again, just his generosity. And what I really appreciate about the show is the great diversity of voices that he brings to the program. You just never know who will show up next or what they'll talk about. And I think that's a great gift and a rare gift in the podcast world. So again, congratulations. I am happy to introduce this show, which I'm actually a part of. I joined Pete and Jim DeFelice for a conversation about the Baseball Hall of Fame, which is very timely at the moment. We recorded this episode prior to the results of the Hall of Fame balloting being announced, so I guess we can find out how prescient we were. Not that that was necessarily the goal. It was a wide-ranging discussion of the Hall of Fame, and there are a million things to talk about. Character, performance, history, and actually I've had a great number of additional thoughts since we recorded. I don't really get a chance to work through my thoughts every day like I used to when I was blogging about baseball every day. So I need I think I need a podcast just to sort of work through what my thoughts and feelings are. So this is sort of an initial attempt anyway, but it seems like so much has changed just in the last few weeks. It's a very dynamic time for the Hall of Fame. I wanted to take this a moment just to briefly mention that I have my own podcast, Sabrcast with Rob Neyer, which we are not even close to 1,000 episodes. We're coming up on 100, but it's a real pleasure to do that. You can find that Sabrcast with Rob Neyer at Sabr's website, sabr.org, sabr.org, and also all the normal podcast outlets, including Apple Podcasts and most of the rest of them. I also wanted to remind people to head over to savethebrave.org and participate in supporting our mission by clicking the donate tab. Great cause, and kudos to Pete for his support. And now, here are some thoughts about the Hall of Fame from me, from the great Jim DeFelice, who has authored so many outstanding books, and my friend, your friend, Pete Turner.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Rob Neyer.
And this is Jim DeFelice, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Happy New Year's Eve, fellas.
You too, buddy.
Yeah, it's fun. We're going to talk Hall of Fame stuff. For those that don't know, Rob has written many books on baseball, over 1 million words on ESPN.com/MLB, and written in all kinds of places about baseball. And then, of course, Jim is a noted baseball fan, a Yankee fan, a person who is... You've worked for the Yankees in some capacity, at least covering them professionally, right, Jim?
We don't like to talk about that.
Never mind.
That's on the low. That's on the down low.
Okay.
I'm actually just here to ask stupid questions.
Perfect. Why don't you start us off?
Well, actually, given everything that's happened this past year, I mean, I'm just really, really hopeful that, we're going to have baseball back, live with fans in the seats this year. I'm ready, willing, and, just chomping at the bit to go. So, I don't know. Hopefully you guys feel the same way.
Yeah.
Well, I have a double interest in this because I'd love to be at Safeco Field. Actually, we don't call it that anymore. I think it's T-Mobile Park. But I'd love to be at a Mariners game next summer. I'm also as you guys know, the commissioner of a baseball league. And if we don't play or we can't have fans, things get a little sticky. So I have a more than just a rooting interest in seeing baseball next summer in all its many splendors. And anyone who says they know what's going to happen this spring or summer is either foolish or lying, because there are so many unknowables still that for most of us, all we can do is hope for the best.
So what's your gut say, Rob? What do you think?
I honestly, my gut doesn't say anything. I mean, I don't trust my gut, so I don't even listen to it. Not in when it comes to matters of health and public policy, because the truth is, in my opinion, this is a little gutty, I guess, but it's also just from sort of paying attention to the way things have been working. I don't think that we can have anything like a normal season until a huge percentage of Americans have been vaccinated. And right now, it's impossible to know how soon that can happen.
Yeah.
Because you have a supply issue, you have a logistics issue, and you have a people issue, in the sense that a lot of people seem not to want to get vaccinated. And how those three dynamics are going to come together over the next 6 months, in my opinion, is utterly unknowable.
And I would add a complicating factor to the people issue. We've been so horrible to one another. Whatever rank ordering is laid out, like, there's going to be fights about that, and there's going to be clashes and disagreement about that. So even if you want to get it, there won't be enough to get, and that will cause no, I'm higher priority than you are. Like, so just...
Well, there will be those fights. There's no question about that. You've got to ultimately produce enough where those fights either don't happen or they end because enough people have been vaccinated. We don't know if that's going to happen in April or August. Nobody knows.
You also have the issue of, some large percentage, it's admittedly overall population is still small, but, some percentage of people have had the virus, and presumably, they're not infecting people.
Right.
So, I don't know. That's another thing. I don't know how the teams or anybody is going to sort that out. One kind of hopeful thing in New York for the Buffalo playoffs for football, they are going to allow fans for the first time, into the stadium. The protocol that they're using, that the last I heard, they're going to be testing. You have to have a test a few days before the event that they let you in. So I don't know what the logistics are going to be. And it's a smaller percentage, obviously, than you would ordinarily have at any football game, let alone a playoff game. So, it'd be interesting. I hope it goes well. But if they're doing that, if they end up doing that for Major League Baseball games, that's another whole issue. But
right, and these are all technical problems that can be solved. Right, you have to have the will. And you have to have the financial resources to solve them. But we've seen other countries do some amazing things with apps and vaccinations and tests. And nobody's done it on a scale we would be talking about, 330 some million people. But these are all technically solvable problems. Do we have the will as a people? But we don't know the answer to that yet.
No, we don't. This is where our diversity is not a blessing. It causes us. Half of us, half of us hate the nation, half of us.
I don't. It's not a half. I mean, I know
right.
you're
Yeah.
joking. It's
Yeah.
more like 20% on the extremes on either side.
Yeah.
Don't want to talk to
Tens
the
of
other
millions
extremes.
of people. Like
Yeah, absolutely, tens of millions, no question.
And
It's not
Brian
half.
brings up a good point, and this kind of goes to the overall the fear and other complicating factors. Brian's like, I can't take my kids to these games because I can't get them a vaccine. Because we're not doing it for kids yet. And just in general, do you think? And I guess this question probably is for you, well, either of you. But I'm thinking about Jim. If the Yankees say we're going to do 25% capacity for fans, are there even that many fans that would be willing to go? Because you guys have been hammered by it out there in New York City. So would there be enough fans to even show up?
That's a good question. I think that, on the one hand, obviously we're very conscious of the effects of the virus because a lot of people have lost, family members, extended or at least extended family members. On the other hand, there's a pretty big fan base here. The question I would have, okay, so if you're only going to have 25%, who's in that 25%? I mean, if you have season tickets, do you get first dibs? Is it some sort of lottery thing?
Right.
And then, if do I have to get tested 3 days before? That might be good for, one game a year or two game, or maybe a game a month or something. But if you had to do that every game that you went to, you'd be being tested every other day, practically. So I don't know the logistics. I want it all to work out. Now I'll tell you that, if I have the opportunity, I certainly am going to be at the first game I can go to, and every game I can go to. But maybe there is a point where, getting a test, getting a stick up your nose or however whatever the late, I guess some of the tests now are a little bit easier. But do you want to do that every night? I don't know.
Well, and you do that every night. How do you prove, where do you get the proof that you tested negative, and how do you show it to somebody?
Yeah.
I that's why I think that, and that sort of thing was done. I believe it was in South Korea. I might be wrong. But those were government administered tests. So they could actually send a message to your phone and your app saying he was officially tested negative. If you're doing a 20-minute test at home, which these are available now, you can find out for yourself pretty quickly and cheaply. But how do you prove that to someone else? Well, you can't. Which is why I really think that ultimately, if we want to get to 100% in the summer, we've got to have a way for people to show that they were vaccinated. Forget about the tests. They were vaccinated. I was vaccinated. Here's my proof on my phone. Let me in.
What if you've had it? Like, and you've had it in the last 3 months, and your antibodies.
Maybe you can get proof that you have the antibodies. Yeah, maybe that's another option.
Do you bring your test with you? You bring your, the lab thing that says I was tested. I had antibodies.
That's fine. If it's a lab, yeah. But I think most people are going to steer toward the home test because it's cheaper and faster. Mm-hmm. And if my barrier for entry to go to a baseball game is to go to a lab and get in line for 2 hours or whatever it is, I'm probably going to wait to go to a game until I don't have to do that anymore. Whereas the vaccination, there are many benefits, but there aren't that many things that I really need to do in crowds. Going to a baseball game is one of those things, but I don't need a test or a vaccination to go to the grocery store or the bookstore. It's only these particular situations that a lot of people, I think, don't want to go to a great deal of extra trouble so they can attend these events. Maybe I'm wrong. Young people probably do because they like to go out to bars and whatnot. At my age, I'm pretty content to stay home most of the time.
I want to ask you guys, especially Rob, because you're a commissioner for an independent league, but this the move by the Major League Baseball to kind of restructure the minor leagues and the push and pull that's going on with that. What are your guys' thoughts about how that's going to impact things? I mean, there wasn't even a minor league season last year, and now the major leagues are trying to redefine these things. Is it the time to take that on? Should they? I don't know. I have no idea what to even think about this.
Well, there are so many elements. Clearly, MLB would like to control baseball from the very top to the bottom for many reasons. This restructuring, it is obviously shaving the number of MLB affiliated jobs by quite a bit. Most of the players who will lose opportunities in affiliated ball were not going to wind up making the major league. Some would, and some still will, because the great majority of cities and towns that are losing their teams will still have baseball, whether it's collegiate summer baseball or independent baseball. In the case, for example, of most of the Pioneer League, which is no longer affiliated, but it's going to have baseball still. You'll still be able to play baseball if you were going to in the old system. You might not get as much money. You might not get the same instruction, the same support that you received when you were playing for an affiliated team. But this is mostly about, well, there's a lot of things, but part of it is baseball wants to have a stronger grip on the development pipeline for the players that they have deemed the most likely to make the major leagues. And they're certainly going to accomplish that.
I know that that's their goal, but, it seems to me, as you cut down on this obviously is going to have some sort of adverse effect on the league, certainly on independence and in the minor league system. I'm wondering if it's going to have any effect on the product that we see on the field. If we're not going to, we're going to get the reverse, that we won't get players as developed as we've been privileged really to see.
Well, Jim, I mean, it's a valid question. It's all theoretical at this point, right? Nobody knows what this is going to look like. What I think that maybe not Rob Manfred would argue, I don't know if he's thought too deeply about this, but I think what player development people within the game would probably argue, the consensus anyway, would be that we're going to have fewer players in our system, but we will, because we have more control, because we have on balance better facilities, because we have fewer 12-hour bus trips, these players will have it will be somewhat easier for them to develop and to learn these new skills, and they'll have the technology available all the time, and they'll have better training facilities in the ballparks that are still around. They'll have better nutrition. MLB is mandated, I think, that players are going to be paid more, minor league players, which I think is a good thing, given some of the horror stories we've heard about players subsisting on fast food and living forward to an apartment and not getting enough sleep, et cetera. So I think they would argue that the players who do come up through the system will be better, will be able to train better, et cetera. We will miss out on some talent, no question. There are going to be some players who don't want to go to the Pioneer League with an unaffiliated team,
right,
or an independent team, and then try to work their way up. And some of those guys would have been major leaguers, no question. There will be some talent lost, for sure.
Rob, is this an opportunity for the independent leagues? I mean, as the MLB clamps down, there's going to be, the ability for higher level independent leagues, all kinds of things. And then do you guys just partner with Driveline? They're a sort of local company, and just say, right, hey, let's invest in these players, and then, like the olden days, just sell them to the major league programs and say, we've got this, undrafted guy that's been through the whole Driveline program. He's been through 2 years of our league play. We'll take $2 million, and you guys can put him in whatever level you want.
Well, what I would say is that, first of all, I should be clear. My league is a collegiate summer league, so we can't sell players to anybody. They just go back to school after our season. But I think it's true that, and by the way, we would like to work with Driveline and hope to this year or this next season. But it is true that independence does bring opportunities. All of a sudden, your roster is not determined by those guys over in New York or Miami, wherever it is. Your roster is determined by how well you can go out and find good players, right? And if I'm marketing my team, typically you have a couple of options. You can either market yourself as, hey, look at these guys, they're going to be in the major league someday. That's the traditional sort of minor league model, right? At least in terms of talent. I think it would be a lot more fun, and if you do it correctly, more successful to say, hey, come and look at our players. We have the best players. We're going to win the most games and bring a championship to your city, right? And teams did that before. The Hillsborough Hops, which is the nearest affiliated minor league team to where I live in Portland, they go to the playoffs every year, and they promote the hell out of that. Do their fans care? I don't know. Probably a little bit, but I think it means more when winning baseball games is prioritized above player development. As a fan, I would be more interested in that, but I'm also probably not a typical fan.
And do you have a sense for how many players are non-traditional in their timeline and approach? I mean, Jamie Moyer isn't any good until he's like 28 years old. There's players that just take longer, or they go to the Mexican League and they learn the super deep, dark changeup that makes them from a catcher into a viable pitcher. I mean, these things do happen. Independent leagues do produce players. Is there a number? And is MLB, I mean, are they working from this kind of approach? Like, look, we're going to lose 10% of these players that are non-traditional, but we're fine with that because we're going to save this and get these other benefits.
How can you know how many you would lose, though? Because these guys will actually have more opportunities. Randy Dobnak, for example, who pitches for the Twins and has put up some nice numbers. I just saw something just yesterday. He came from the United Shore Baseball League, which is a 14 league that plays out of one ballpark in the Detroit metropolitan area. I think he's the only major leaguer so far that came out of that league. Well, there are going to be a lot more leagues like that, more opportunities like that, with all these places losing their affiliations. Does that mean so? The Randy Dobnaks of the world theoretically have more opportunities now to play baseball somewhere and develop their talents and show the scouts what they can do. So I actually think that I don't know who you lose. You're going to lose some people who won't get drafted anymore. By the way, the draft is going to be much smaller in future years. I think it's going to be 10 rounds, 10 or 20, where it used to be 40 or 50 or even 60.
Yeah.
So how many of those guys who would have been drafted in the 24th round now don't get drafted and say, you know what? If I'm not even good enough to get drafted, I'm just going to quit baseball. Yes, I could go play in the Pioneer League, or I could play in the United Shore League, but I'd rather go get a job doing whatever. It's going to pay better, and I have a better future there. So who knows? We don't know how many of those guys are going to be lost.
Or just pick baseball or basketball or football instead. Frank Thomas now says, hey, forget it. I'm going to go do something else. How about Mike Piazza? He becomes a plumber or something.
Well, Mike Piazza's father was a billionaire, as I recall, so I don't think that was ever really an option for him.
Should we talk about the Hall of Fame a little bit?
Sure.
Jim, what are your thoughts on this class? Did you work through a ballot at all, or do you have any favorites?
I'm not a voter or associated with anything. I'm just a guy with crappy opinions. So I think I think just looking at last year's holdovers, Schilling seems to be kind of the favorite to come in this year. And speaking as a Yankee fan, remembering that stupendous kills me to say that stupendous performance he had in the playoffs against the Yankees, based on that one game. He definitely, I would have to say, and you could put a gun to my head, I would have to admit that he belongs in the Hall of Fame just based on that game. I don't know that that's really a valid criteria for anybody getting into the Hall, but outside of him, I think he's clearly the traditional favorite. The big question I have would be, does Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, do they get in? Because they have, if we took the obviously the big issue of steroids off the table, they would certainly have been in, a couple of rounds ago. I forget. I think they were on number, is their 8th time maybe, or 7th. So, so I mean, that's going to be a big issue with a lot of voters, I would imagine.
Yeah. The question on Schilling. Let me ask you this, Rob. This is an interesting point that Jim brings up. That bloody sock game. Is that comparable to a playoff no-hitter? I mean, is this something that, because these things define careers, right? Whoever, Halladay has a no-hitter. Don Larson's always known for his no-hitter. Is this comparable to that?
Well, I think that, sure. Short answer is yes. It falls under the heading of legendary postseason performances. The Hall of Fame voters have typically not been particularly swayed by the postseason. And, the one counterexample would be Jack Morris, right? Who perhaps wouldn't have been elected without his Game 7, I believe it was a shutout, 10-inning shutout against the Braves. Having said that, he also needed, I think what got him in was that, and also being the winningest pitcher in the 1980s. He needed 2 hooks, essentially. If you don't have the overwhelming numbers, you need a hook, or you often need a hook. And Morris had 2 because his other numbers, his ERA was not all that impressive, to name just one. He didn't win a Cy Young Award. I don't think he did, but he did have those hooks. And I think that's what got him in ultimately. Schilling is underrated, believe it or not.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at his just regular season wins above replacement, I'm not saying they're the be-all, end-all, but fantastic, right? And then look at the body of his postseason work. And for me, postseason play is a great tiebreaker. If someone's sort of on the line, which a lot of players are, I think postseason performance is a tiebreaker. And Schilling is fantastic, not just that one game. So to me, his postseason performance elevates him well beyond leaving out the other baggage. It elevates him well above any line that I would draw if I were voting.
Yeah, and not he certainly doesn't need me pushing his candidacy, but if you look at overall in his career, I think his walks and hits per inning is very impressive. So which I don't know if this is really the time to get into, but there's always been kind of a debate. I remember reading this in, actually, I think it was Bill James' Historic Abstract back. That's got to be in the 90s or so, or maybe late 80s when that came out.
The first one, yeah.
And talking about, do you evaluate a player based on peak season or peak performances versus their overall career?
And I'd say there's not a right answer there, right?
Yeah. Right.
If you go to baseballreference.com, you can see Jay Jappy's metric JAWS, which and what he does, among the things he does is look at peak seasons or top 7 seasons. I know Baseball Reference lists those too. And that's utterly arbitrary. You're picking 7 or 5. I think Brian Kinney likes to look at a player's best 8 season run. Why 8, Brian? I mean, I love Brian, don't get me wrong, but it's arbitrary. You could look at whether or not those things, the 8s or the 7s, conforms to the existing standards. I don't think that it does. It's just something that people seem to think is reasonable, which it is. But what about 9? You okay with 9? What about 6? Dale Murphy had an amazing 6 season run. So I don't think there's a right answer there. I like to look at, Bill James once said, speaking of Bill, just sort of tossed off this comment about evaluating players, and he said everything counts. And that's kind of how I try to look at it. It all counts for me. 6, 8, 10, 20, show me everything, and then let me sort it out.
What about a guy like I think like Tim Hudson, for instance? I think he was he pitched about 17 seasons. Something, his longevity be something that you factor in too.
Yeah, and I'm looking at him right now, and he's one of those guys who definitely is borderline. He's got a tremendous winning percentage, 22 and 133, 625 winning percentage, which is fantastic, well above, I suspect, most Hall of Famers. He also pitched for really good teams. He never won a Cy Young, but was in the top 5 4 times. His postseason record is good, but not by no means great. He won 1 postseason game in his career. So he's the sort of guy who I would probably have a tough time voting for on the first ballot. Not because I think that there's a difference between first and second ballot guys. I've always thought that was silly. I just think that the more time you have to study a candidacy, the better off you are. And if somebody's on the borderline for me, I'd probably hold off and give it some more thought the next year, because our perceptions, our knowledge does change over the years.
The context too, right? Like so Mike Petriello did a great piece on MLB.com. Everybody should check that out. And he talked about there's like certain positions get lost, and now it looks like certain eras of positions get lost. So third basemen have long suffered from, they're sort of tweeners. They're not quite shortstops. You're not quite, first baseman or whatever. And so they look weird. And now it appears that pitchers look really weird. We're trying to determine what a great pitcher is. I think Tim Hudson might look a lot better in 20 years when we know what greatness looks like for this era.
That's right. Yep.
Johan Santana. And again, Cone, Wells, Hershiser, these guys were incredible pitchers. We're probably going to have to continue to deal with their credentials. And then I wanted to bring up Andy Pettit and ask Jim specifically, does he seem like a Hall of Famer to you? Because on that team, the Yankees stable of Hall of Famers, it's like, Andy Pettit, he might play on a Hall of Fame team for the Yankees, but maybe not.
Okay. Put me on the spot here. I think Andy was a great pitcher. For me, Andy is just a guy that's just on the borderline of being in the Hall of Fame. On the other hand, I have to admit, if I wanted a pitcher, if I really had to win that game in the in the series, I'd want Andy Pettit. So fortunately, I don't have a vote. But no, I think I love Andy Pettit, and now I will get bombarded by every Yankee fan I know, and probably not be allowed into the stadium. But I think he's a borderline. Was a great pitcher, but the Hall of Fame should be reserved for just that next level. The difference between, if you had to ask who would you prefer on the team, and who would you prefer watching you when everything's on the line? I would go with Clemens over Pettit. I got to be honest. And now probably will not be allowed in anywhere near the Bronx.
To be fair, Clemens is basically the best pitcher for the last 100 years. You want to pick a different guy, great, but Clemens is the next guy. So it's okay to pick Clemens. You shouldn't feel bad about that.
And by the way, I'd like somebody to you're right about starting pitchers. We don't know yet. We haven't sorted this era out really. But in many ways, there's almost no difference in terms of how dominant they were and for how long, between Andy Pettit and Tim Hudson and Mark Burley. They're all roughly the same, again, roughly. And Pettit, of course, gets a big bump because he won 19 postseason games. His ERA in the postseason, was it better than his regular season ERA? A little bit, but not. It was basically the same performance. Now he's facing better opponents, so great. If I think we could elevate Pettit above Hudson and Burley because of his postseason performance. The question is how much. Is that enough? And I don't know the answer, but I agree with Jim that he's certainly borderline. But which side of the border? We all get to decide.
Yeah, and I have to say I would elevate him over those two pitchers. Just to, Now I can go into the Bronx. I can't get in the stadium, but I can go in the Bronx.
Well, I like to think of players like being 10% or 20% better. Like Gary Sheffield's like almost as good as Barry Bonds in a lot of ways, right? So is there enough energy to get him above the line? Mike Mussina goes into the Hall of Fame fairly easily, but to differentiate all these pitchers between, Mike Mussina and those guys, there's not a lot of difference. I mean, is there even 10% difference in terms of?
I had Mussina quite a bit better.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The thing with Mussina, you got to remember he pitched for Baltimore for so long, and with all due respect to my friends in Baltimore, he was a hell of a pitcher throughout his career, not just with the Yankees.
So is Mike Mussina a no doubt about her? And if he isn't there room below him for a guy like Pettie or Hudson? And I mean, especially Burley. Burley left with a lot of energy left in his career.
Well, I would say that Mussina wasn't a no-doubter. I think he took him 3 or 4 or 5 tries to make it, right?
Okay.
So he might have been no-doubter to me and to you, but to the voters, bizarrely, in my opinion, he wasn't a no-doubter. He was, for many voters, a borderline choice. And if he's borderline, what does that make those other guys you mentioned?
Yeah.
But having said that, if you look at the history of the Hall of Fame and the voting, you see some very strange things. You see players who get 10% their first ballot and then 10 years later get 78%. What changed? I talked about perceptions changing and knowledge. It changed that much. So players build momentum on the ballot for whatever reasons. So I could certainly see Hudson and Pettit and even Burley down the road building more and more support. But there is a significant gap between them and Mussina, who was considered borderline by a lot of voters.
There's also the thing, the way that the ballot works, when you have certain players on there, everybody's going to, a certain number of votes. You can only vote for a certain percentage anyway.
You can vote for 10. Yep.
Yeah. So, everybody's going to vote for Jeter.
Right.
Last year. And, so maybe that knocked, and maybe that's one other factor.
That absolutely happens. Yep.
So
no question.
Rob, is there room? I mean, you've had a Hall of Fame vote. I believe you had, right? Like you had it.
I haven't. No, I wasn't. I think I fell way short of the number of years, membership years in the BBWA to get a ballot.
So if you had a ballot and you were going to vote and someone like Jeter is on there, do you have a problem with someone saying, hey, I know Jeter's going to breeze in. He doesn't need to be unanimous, but I do want to make sure we're still continuing to consider, Kenny Lofton or Johan Santana. Is it okay to kick a vote back to the back of the pack since it is so crowded, or has been until recently?
My personal opinion is that it's perfectly acceptable to there's somebody came up with a name for that. I absolutely would have considered it if I thought if there were 10 deserving players aside from Derek Jeter, absolutely I would consider leaving him off. The problem, and I know that Sean Foreman talked about this. Sean Foreman discussed not voting for Jeter. Ultimately, he voted for him purely because he didn't want to deal with the vitriol that he would have received publicly.
Right.
Which I totally sympathize with. I don't know if I would have had the courage to leave Jeter off the ballot. Now you could just keep your ballot private, but there is most of the younger voters, especially, I think, want to be open about their ballot so they can talk about it, and they want the process to be public, which I think is it's healthy, but there are some advantages to keeping your ballot secret, and one of them would be to make decisions like that without having to worry about being crushed by idiots.
One of the guys that got elected recently, but took him a long time, was Tim Raines. And there was an argument. I think Jason Stark made it, but it might have been Poznansky that made it. But basically, he said Tim Raines got to first base more than Tony Gwynn did, and it was like,
that's right.
Oh, yep. Shoot, I didn't realize. And there's that one moment, super clarity, of course, because Tim Raines wasn't quite as good as Ricky Henderson. He wasn't a superpower. He had these things where he wasn't quite enough, and then you realize, wow. I mean, Tony Gwynn, he's a legend. Tim Raines must be good.
Well, there's also the thing on what media market he's playing in. you know, if so, yes, he's playing at the same time when Ricky Henderson is, but there's no doubt that certain markets, they get a lot more publicity, not just in the home market. I think that if you play rather for the Yankees, you're going to get, or the Dodgers, you're going to get more attention than you would get, in Minnesota, say.
Well, and I talked about hooks before. Raines didn't have a hook.
Yeah.
His hook could have been best leadoff man in baseball. Sorry, Ricky Henderson's got that one. Could have been best base stealer in the National League. Well, he got that for a couple years, but then all of a sudden, here's Vince Coleman. And the other problem that Raines had was that his game completely changed the last 8 or 10 years of his career, when he was still effective because he got on base all the time, but he wasn't stealing 60, 80 bases. So Hall of Fame voters have typically not been kind to players with long tails on their career, where they weren't in the All-Star game every year, where they weren't MVP candidates. But you look at the body of work, and of course Raines deserved to be in long before he was. I could see the argument against him, but people weren't making that argument. They just seemed to sort of forget him. And it took a lot of work from, Jonah Carey did an immense amount of work to keep Raines' name out there in front of the voters and make the case for him. And others did as well. And I believe Raines made it in his last year. It might have been his next to last year, but
right.
clearly deserving.
He also,
but you mentioned Kenny Lofton
on him a little bit too. That went back when that mattered, a long time ago.
Right.
Cocaine and all that other kind of stuff. Not that matters, but it did back then.
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of Raines was better known for cocaine than some other players, but Paul Molitor, for example, nobody brought up cocaine when Paul Molitor was a Hall of Fame candidate. Didn't even come up. So, and he had some significant issues. A lot of selective things happen, and it's difficult to understand why. But drug use was never held against any player, really, until the steroid era. You could argue that might have cost Raines a few votes, but I really don't think that had much to do with it.
I think that, kind of the explosion over the last decade or so in the availability of statistics, and basically you can get almost any statistic you want. I think that has helped, build, in terms of building support for different players, over time. I don't know. I'm wondering though if there are any examples where it's hurt people.
That's a good question. I've never thought about that, Jim, but I think you're probably right. I mean, there were players elected decades ago who did not have impressive statistical resumes, but nobody really paid attention to that stuff. And that, with the exception of Harold Baines, that really hasn't happened in quite a while.
We talked about this before, but I want to bring it up, Rob, because I think it's worth repeating in case someone hasn't heard one of the other conversations. Harold Baines, we looked down on that decision, but if you take the strikes that he did as he fought with the union to try to get more rights for players, which all players now stand on those guys are sacrificing their shoulders. If he doesn't get the 3,000 hits, he's probably north of 2,900. And there's a lot of players that get credit for World War II service. It's a different form of service. Johnny Damon, Al Oliver, these guys that get to within, a season, maybe that, and then you throw in strikes. Are we being too hard on these guys?
Well, I think everything counts. There are certainly players in the Hall of Fame because they collected a large number of hits and didn't do a great deal else. They tend to be players from the 1920s and 30s, not the 80s and 90s. Beta Pinson is a guy who came, I think, roughly a season short of 3,000 hits. Not many people argue for him as a Hall of Famer. He probably was a better player on balance, did more to help his teams win than Baines did or Johnny Damon did. So I don't know. Look, we can talk about the technical parts of the Hall of Fame and wins above replacement and why you're going to vote for Curt Schilling and maybe I'm not. But on a philosophical level, the question I would always ask if I were voting about a player is not is this player better than some guys in the Hall of Fame, because that's true of hundreds of players. The question I would ask is, does this player, as near as I can tell, does he raise or at least maintain the current standards of the institution? Because to me as a voter, what you're doing is you're serving the institution, not the candidates themselves, not yourself, the institution. And so in the case of Baines is a tough one because he was a DH, but there aren't many of those in there. But in the case of a starting pitcher or a shortstop, I'm going to look at all the guys in there at that position, and I'm going to say to myself, is he better than at least half of these guys? Because if he's not, I'm lowering the standards by voting for him, not maintaining them. And that's sort of my baseline for everybody. I don't think Vada Pinson, for example, I doubt if he would raise or maintain the standards for Hall of Fame center fielders. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at Pinson in a long time, but that's how I think about these things typically.
What if that position is? Oh, sorry, Jim. You go ahead.
No, go ahead. You were going to follow up.
I was going to say, what about the positional problem of like, hey, third base is really hard, or some other aspect that's not accounted for? I mean, are you lowering the bar if you're trying to get these guys up to the standard of the?
No, the third baseman discussion is really interesting, because for many years, Hall of Fame voters had no idea what they were doing when it came to third baseman. It took Eddie Matthews, who was at the time the best third baseman who ever played. It took him years to get in. Why? It took Ron Santo, who was probably, when he retired, top 5 all time. Took him 25 or 30 years to get into the Hall of Fame.
And he had to be dead to get there.
He was dead to get there, right? Yeah. So third base Scott Rowland is another great example, who's on the ballot now. And in my mind, is well-deserving, probably raises the standards for the position, at least maintains them. He's going to have a tough time because Rowland, 2 of his attributes, great defense and getting on base, are underappreciated by Hall of Fame voters still today. Not as much as they used to be, but they still are. So third base is tough. You can make arguments for Ken Boyer and Greg Nettles and probably Buddy Bell, just to sort of lift the numbers for third baseman to maybe where they should be. But that's a special case. I think if you look at the other positions, they're pretty evenly balanced in terms of the overall numbers.
Well, I think defense. That's a good point. I mean, it's even with some of the advances in terms of measuring defense these days, it's still very, very hard to really evaluate that. And you can say, well, this player, I know they're a good defensive player, and their metrics kind of bear that out. But it's rare. I mean, how many players have gotten into the Hall of Fame primarily because they're were in for defensive purposes?
5 or 6, maybe. I mean, I would say certainly Mazeroski.
Right.
That's one.
Dave Bancroft, who's shouldn't be in. Rabbit Moranville, who's marginal. That's about it. There really aren't many at all who are there primarily. Ozzie Smith, obviously, although he's a better hitter than maybe people give him credit
Brooks
for.
Robinson?
But Ozzie's in because of his
For
defense.
his glove?
Who?
Brooks Robinson? Is he there primarily for his glove?
I think he would have made it even as an average third baseman because of his longevity. But you might, maybe. I mean, well, let's put he probably lasted longer in the lineup because of his glove, which allowed him to pile up those numbers. So he probably goes in that group.
The steroid issue is still being sorted out. Again, you read guys like Jaffe and other people, they talk about if Selig is in, then, we have to relook at these steroid guys. So Clemens, Bonds, Sheffield, Poppy's coming up. All these players have this thing to deal with. And I guess I would say before I shut up, when Bonds is facing people, he's facing Todd Stottlemyre. Sorry, Yankees fans. Sorry, Jim. Who's like, I blew up my rotator cuff. I just got my whole body strong. And then he showed up way bigger. And you're like, come on. So he's facing guys who are doing it. If the field is played at that level, not that everybody was, but it seems like we can't quite be so hard on these guys anymore.
I think that we like to think of not just baseball players, but people as, I'll just speak about men for a second because I know them better probably. Bad guys and good guys. He's a good guy. He's a bad guy. We sort people out that way, but the truth is that most of the things that people do, at least publicly, are a result of their culture. And the culture in baseball was to use drugs. Like it or not, it was. Now, were there players who wanted nothing to do with drugs? Absolutely. Just like when you've got a crooked police department, there are good cops in those police departments. When you've got a crooked, whatever it is, service workers union, I remember I always think about this. There was a story 6 or 8 years ago about a public employees union. I believe it was someplace near New York. Jim, you probably remember this. I think it might have been on Long Island. And like 90% of the members of this union had retired because of disability. And when some reporters went out and looked around, they found that these people were all playing golf and doing deadlifting and skydiving on disability. You remember this, Jim?
Yeah.
These weren't all bad
That's New
people.
York.
These weren't all bad people, is my point. It was however it happened, that became the culture. And we just tend to go along with whatever the culture is around us. And that was the culture in baseball. So it's hard for me to be too judgmental about the players of the 90s when everything around them was saying, hey, this is what we're doing now. We're putting this in our bodies and we're gaining 30 pounds and hitting the ball 500 feet or throwing 96. That's what we do. We all like to think that we would have the character to resist becoming a part of that. I'm not that confident in my character. So it's hard for me to be judgmental.
Yeah, and especially when it's something that you can do to make yourself better at your job or your game. And right. I just think that Barry Bonds, just his what he did in baseball, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame on those numbers. And you could certainly make an argument that he was great even before,
And the same thing with Clemens.
And the same thing with
the
Clemens.
Bodies of work are just overwhelming.
And as Rob says, there were other players, a lot of other players. It's just that those guys stand out for whatever reason they stand out.
Now, if you want to take a player like Mark Maguire, let's assume that you think he's a borderline candidate based on just the numbers, which I would argue that perhaps he is. He did a couple of things really well, drew walks, hit home runs, didn't do much else to help his teams win. If you want to use drugs or telling fibs in a congressional hearing as a tiebreaker, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong and shouldn't do that. But Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, this isn't a tiebreaker situation. These are utterly dominant players, drugs or no drugs. And generally speaking, the Hall of Fame has never been about character. We might like it to be, but it never has been.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Start and you could, and whoever you want to pick. I mean, Babe Ruth, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Who was a character, a great character. So yeah, to that point, absolutely.
When we look at the steroid thing too, I'm always like you, Rob. I it's hard for me to be too judgmental of somebody because I don't know if there was a pill that would make authors 30% better.
I'm on. Give it.
Done.
Well, actually, yeah, coffee, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. What I would probably say is I'll take that pill, but only until for the 3 months I need to finish this book, right? But then the next book comes along, right? And how do you resist that one? So, I mean, I get it. I really do.
Well, and with that pill, though, comes greater sales. I mean, the next contract is better. And
Right.
so you're just like chugging these pills down, you know? And then if you're Stephen King and you're not worried about selling books and somebody starts crushing you, you're like, well, like,
Well, especially because people, probably a lot of fans like to think that players took drugs, at least in part because they were motivated by money. And sure, there's some of that, but most of these guys are intensely competitive and want to win games more. They want to be the best player they can be and be better than the guy over here. I know there was a survey years and years ago where Olympic athletes were asked, and these were not professionals for the most part, were asked if you could take a pill that would guarantee a gold medal, but would take 10 years off your life, would you do it? And 90% of them said they would.
Sure.
It wasn't about the money. It was about reaching this thing that they've been trying to reach for who knows how many years. And players are not immune. Baseball players are not immune to that. Those feelings.
Yeah, and I think, and not to beat a dead horse here, but I think that now there's a feeling that that you don't use drugs, that there's testing and stuff. So I think that I think we're in a somewhat different period now than than they were, or at least that they were in when they started using them.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I no doubt about that.
And intelligent fans, and hopefully we're all intelligent fans. You go and you look at who's in the Hall of Fame, and you understand that they're from different eras. And somebody from the dead ball era, they had the game was different then. The game was different in the 80s and the 90s than it is now in the 20s.
I would say that the one thing that gives me pause during these conversations is that if we assume that steroids were a performance enhancer, and I there are people who think that they weren't. I don't believe that. Joe Sheehan seems to believe it. Joe Sheehan's a really smart guy, and I would never dismiss his opinions out of hand. But let's assume for a moment that they were performance enhancing. We do have to face the conundrum of what to do with players who didn't use drugs, right? The problem is, of course, that we don't know that Fred McGriff didn't use drugs. Should we take him for his word? You can. I don't know that we should take anyone at their word necessarily. Ken Griffey Jr., did he take drugs? Everybody says no. How can I know? Right. I'm not that smart. But certainly, if we assume that steroids helped, and B, we assume that Fred McGriff didn't use them, we're talking about a 550, 600 home run guy now who, if he had used drugs, and he'd be in the Hall of Fame. Are we being fair to him? I don't know.
Yeah.
The other thing about the drugs is typically the way that they work is that they enable you to do other things and recover from them quicker. Right. Weight training or what have you. So It's not like, you just pop this magic pill and now you're this fantastic baseball player. And you can see that in Bond's career, for instance.
Yep.
They didn't just go out to Dunkin' Donuts, have a couple of dozen donuts, and have a steroid in between there.
Right.
And there's been a lot of advances in terms of nutrition now and just general training and stuff that also will make a difference. And those are allowed.
One of the things we've seen, by the way, is not the demise, but the near demise of older players, especially position players, having dominant seasons, which we saw a great number of in the 90s. Players in their late 30s, early 40s, putting together these big numbers. And that's kind of gone away, which is an argument for the effectiveness of sports drugs, at least the banned sports drugs. So I don't think that we yet have a full accounting of what the drugs did to the numbers in that era.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, too, about the drug thing, and I always like to bring this up because it's an important point, things that you can do to your body legally in baseball. You can have someone run a drill up and down the joint ball of your hip to recondition it. You can literally perforate your hip. You can go and get stem cells injected into your body. You can have your cornea swapped out or carved on by a laser. You can have a rib removed to improve your thoracic outlets condition. You can do any number of things. You can take a dead person's body part and put it in your body in a number of areas, and all of that is not performance enhancing. And so at some point it's like, hey, if science is going to be like, I would consider like a Formula One kind of model. Like if you want to build a super player, these guys are at the elite level, nothing below that, but I'd be interested in doing that, because at some point you're not going to be able to beat the science. People are going to be, we're approaching gene engineering at this point. So that's
and bionics, right?
Yeah.
we have the technology. You guys are old enough to remember Steve Austin.
Yeah.
Probably.
Boy,
Maybe you're not.
Deal.
Maybe you're not, Pete.
$6 million. Yeah, I remember.
But there's never going to be a moment when we say, "Oh, today's when the bionic guy arrived." We're slowly working toward bionic people. And how do we analyze baseball when you can have bionic eyes installed 10, 15 years from now?
Neural net's going to be in. You would never know it.
Well, there you go.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's coming.
It's coming. So some of these things, I don't know. I'm not sure how much more you can do about it and how you divide the line between this is fair and not. And also to the steroid era players' defense, it wasn't against the rules. Baseball has its favorite kinds of cheating. So you got folks that are encouraging it, and so you do it. I'm not mad at Greg Vaughn for improving his ability to make money, or Mo Vaughn, or any of the Vaughns. It's Vaughn Hayes, to throw another Vaughn in there. I'm out of Vaughns now.
Oh, you forgot Van Halen. We go to the Vans.
I'm curious on your guys' thoughts on. I'm pro Joe Jackson. He served out the term of his banning because he's been dead 50 plus years.
He did not serve. He did not serve out his term.
Is it forever? I thought it was lifetime.
He is absolutely not. The word is permanent. Permanently suspended.
All right.
And that takes you well into the grave.
And beyond, obviously.
Yeah.
Apparently. So are we open to having Joe Jackson come in, Pete Rose come in? Have they done enough, or are they still permanent?
I wouldn't drop them in the same bucket, because in my mind, the betting on your own team is not equivalent to accepting money in the interest of losing games. We'll never know exactly what Jackson did, what was going through his mind. We do know that he accepted $5,000 and spent it. And in my mind, that was justified a permanent ban. Rose, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, I agree. There's a difference in terms, and again, looking at the guys who use steroids, they are attempting to play the game better. Rose, phenomenal player, and as a manager, he has his pros and cons, but he wasn't, as Rob is saying, he wasn't trying to. The last thing Pete Rose was doing was trying to lose a baseball game. He probably would lose his arm before he would voluntarily lose a baseball game. So I think there is a difference there.
Is there though? Okay, let's just believe Rose that he only bet on his team to win, not that he would ever go the other direction to make up a bet. Okay, we'll give him that. But you also are now affecting that one game and potentially players' careers by going and placing all of your chips on the table for this one August 3rd game or whatever it is. Isn't that just as detrimental? Like if your team is going to be compromised the next 4 games because of your
because it's about really it's about the integrity of the sport. And yes, both of those things compromise the integrity, but one compromise is actually literally trying to lose Doesn't that by definition compromise the integrity to a much greater degree than maybe altering your chances to win this game relative to this other one that you're also trying to win?
Sure.
Neither of them are good, and certainly a significant punishment was deserved. I'll give you an example that something I think is more reasonable. In the NFL, the punishment for betting against your own team is a lifetime suspension. The punishment for betting on your own team is 1 year, which is the punishment that Paul Hornung, for example, served back in the 1960s, I believe. That seems reasonable to me. Bet on your own team, which is horrible. You're out for a whole year. That's a lot, right? But it seems to me that the reason baseball's punishment is so severe for betting on your own team obviously goes back to 1920. That's where it all started. And it seemed like a good idea then, probably was. I'm not sure it makes a great deal of sense in exactly 100 years later.
Well, there's also not a Comiskey not paying you very much money. I mean, that
not true. Misconception, Pete.
Oh, okay.
The White Sox were well paid.
Okay.
They were among the best paid players in all of Major League Baseball.
Nice. I've learned something today. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Reserve clause aside, then I don't know.
Yes, so you can complain about the reserve clause, but the White Sox were actually quite well paid. For people who have seen the movie 8 Men Out, and it's quite a good movie, but the rationales offered for the White Sox throwing the World Series, or the Black Sox throwing the World Series, are completely concocted, somewhat partly by the filmmaker, partly by the writer who wrote the book the movie was based on. But the story about Eddie Seacott being screwed out of a bonus because he didn't get a chance to win his 30th game, none of that's true. And the idea that the White Sox were underpaid, not true. The White Sox getting stale champagne for their pennant celebration, not true. It's all the White Sox were.
Are you telling me that Hollywood didn't get it right?
Not even the great John Sayles. Wow. Correct.
Yeah.
And also no one's clamoring for Buck Weaver to get in. It's just Joe, and that's it.
Yep.
Well, just so everybody knows, I have no problem with Pete Rose getting in now. He's done enough in my book, and as intolerable as he can be personally, let the guy have a couple of years as the Hall of Fame guy. I'm fine with it.
I agreed.
Jim, any questions left?
Well, I guess we were talking about who's going to be on the ballot and stuff. What do you guys think of Manny? Should Manny Ramirez be in?
He's one of those borderline guys for me. Yeah. If you look at I'm going to flip over to Baseball Reference now, and I mean, people think he has an overwhelming case, and it's quite a good case.
He's got a good case.
You look at, again, going back to wins above replacement, his wins above replacement clearly put him in the middle of that conversation. I would then begin to ask, okay, he's at 69 wins above replacement, which, by the way, is almost exactly the same as Scott Rowland. Again, not be all end all wins above replacement. Did he help? How much did he hurt or help his teams aside from that raw number I just quoted? Was he a great mentor to younger players? I don't know.
Well,
maybe.
Well,
Was he disruptive at times? Absolutely. Did he hurt his teams by being suspended in the middle of seasons and causing the front office to have to scramble to replace him? Yes, he was. So to me, those things drop him into a borderline category with Sheffield and Todd Helton and Andy Pettit and Bobby Abreu. So I'm kind of on the fence with him. How about you, Jim?
I think based on numbers, I think he's over the line, right. And in his prime, very dangerous. You would just not want to be facing him, and right. The other baggage is the other baggage. But as we said earlier, the Hall of Fame kind of looks the other way on a lot of that baggage. So I think and again, speaking as a Yankee fan, boosting another Boston Red Sox. I think he's over the line. I'm not saying that he's a first ballot choice or a unanimous choice or anything like that, but I think he was certainly of that era and a dangerous hitter in his prime.
I used to, when I wrote about this stuff daily, I would spend hours studying every candidate when they arrived on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't done that with Manny because he hasn't on the ballot for that long. I think if I were a voter, he's one of the players, and this is true of most of them, where I would have to do some digging. Mm-hmm. Again, anybody who's just looking at wins above replacement and then checking them off the list, whether they clear a certain threshold, I think that there's a certain amount of art that should come into Hall of Fame voting, to a somewhat lesser degree MVP voting, but really any kind of award voting. If you're just looking at the numbers, that's the place to start. It's not where I would want to be finishing. And
I agree with that, and I think that that's one of the things that the baseball writers, to kind of give them credit. That's one of the things that they are trying to do directly or indirectly by having people, with a lot of experience, because they've actually seen these games and they've seen, the player, and they don't have to just rely on the, on the statistics.
Right.
I'm all for Manny Ramirez being in, and I'll tell you why I think he's over the line in terms of being borderline. There are certain players that make the entire lineup better. There's this misconception that elite players like Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds need protection in lineup. They are the protection. And so when Manny stands in front of you or behind you in the lineup, he makes Big Papi better. And look, he's great too. I mean, he's going to go in the Hall of Fame almost for sure. But Manny Ramirez made people 2 and 3 batters down the line better because he was always on base. You didn't want to pitch, you had to pitch to somebody. Benito Santiago got pitched to because you didn't want to deal with Barry Bonds. And so I think that Manny's one of those players, where Sheffield as well, where they were so dangerous and they were able to get on base so much that, that they made their team better, at least in their immediate orbit in terms of the lineup. So I think Manny comes over that line. He comes with a lot of baggage, of course, and, but he was so incredible at the plate that I think all the other stuff is sort of secondary. But it does make me think about, with all the first basemen that are there and the sluggers who live in left field because they don't do much else, we're definitely missing value in other players. Like, I'm not saying that Carlos Baerga should be a Hall of Famer, but maybe second basemen are just not as likely to have a 20-year career because of the position or whatever, and we don't give credit for that loss.
Catchers,
yeah.
What about, you mentioned the guy earlier, Pete. You mentioned Kenny Lofton.
Yeah.
Kenny Lofton was a really good player for a long time. Similar to Lou Whitaker, a really good player for a long time. And neither of them ever won MVP awards or even came close, although they probably came a lot closer than Omar Vizquel. But because they didn't have those hooks, right? Lofton doesn't have a hook. Whitaker doesn't really, except for being with Trammell forever. And they just get left behind, and it's really a shame. And I would agree with you. You're right. We just forget about, and especially if a player's value comes from a broad base of skills, which was true of Whitaker and Lofton both. They just get forgotten, and it's terribly unfair.
Well, I don't want to keep you guys all day. Anything you guys want to say in closing at all?
I had so many thoughts. Jim, go ahead. You go first.
No, that's okay. I've already there's enough places I can't go now. So,
well, how about this? I'll ask you a final question, Jim. Giancarlo Stanton started early, crushes the ball hard, has MVPs. Is he going to make the Hall of Fame?
Is he going to make the Hall of Fame? Of course he's going to make the Hall of Fame because he's going to lead the Yankees to 10 more World Series victories.
Hey, Jim, here's a question for you.
Incredible.
Who led the Yankees in home runs last season?
Luke. Well, that's not really what we're talking about, but an incredible, player who seemingly came from nowhere, but between the Yankee scouting and coaching, and obviously his work ethic and everything that he did, just his career just totally blossomed. And maybe that's getting back to where we started. Maybe hopefully there's going to still be room for those guys in leagues other than those that are controlled by MLB.
I think for the most part, the talent, even if MLB misses it in the draft or they aren't signed as free agents out of college or high school, most of that talent will rise because there will be so much baseball being played, all the same places that we're seeing it now, and maybe even and probably more places. Baseball is actually, believe it or not, is a growth industry. So I think the talent pipeline will still be there, and most of the same players will rise through it. It might not be as efficient as it once was, but I actually don't think we're going to lose a lot of talent, especially as people start paying even more attention to concussions. I think that we'll have more talent, not less, playing baseball and rising up and showing up in major league ballparks.
That concussion, we talk about traumatic brain injuries. There's also brain injuries, and that you're right. It's such a big part of things. People are not going to want their kids to play hockey and football as much as they used to.
And soccer even.
Yeah. We had a guy who's a specialist in recovering from brain injuries, he's a doctor, and he's like, I only do chest traps now. I never head the ball anymore because he knows what happens to a brain from heading the ball,
Wow.
Yep.
So, I just want to say thanks to you guys. Everybody should go check out Rob's books on Amazon. The link is on the page. If you're on the podcast side, you can definitely get the link in there. Support Rob's writing. It's so entertaining. He's done it for so long, and you're so great at it, Rob. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and Jim happens to be an incredible author too. I was thinking about reading West Like Lightning again. I want to recommend that book to Rob. It's so good. It's his story of the Pony Express. You guys can, same thing. There's the link to Jim's books. He's written, 50 plus books, including American Sniper and Codename Johnny Walker, my buddy Johnny Walker. So again, two incredible authors. Definitely support these guys, buy their books, and then we'll have them come back on the show whenever they have a new one come out. Thank you, fellas.
Great to see you guys. Thanks.
Great to be on. Thank you.